Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I want to do a quick review for you of this little guy. This right here is the Peter Rassenti Custom Druid pocket knife. And I want to thank my buddy Nico for sending this guy along. This actually came to me straight from Peter Rassenti, but I'll be sending it to Nico here shortly. And so this is fresh off the factory floor, get a chance to see it in its perfect condition, so to speak. Price on this guy was around $1,300, and there's not going to be a disassembly video, and that's for a couple of reasons. First off, the action's great. It doesn't need it. Second off, integrals can be a little bit tricky, and I'm going to be honest with you here. I'm not confident enough to take apart a $1,300 custom knife and put a buddy's knife on the line after he generously gave it to me straight from the factory. So that's not going to be happening. That said, you can watch my disassembly of a Peter Rassenti Spyderco Nirvana to get a sense of what taking an integral apart that's well designed can actually look like, that is. Let's do a quick size comparison here. This right here is your Spyderco Delica, which is a smaller knife, absolutely. This right here is your Spyderco PM2, which is in the same department in terms of your blade length overall. Right here, we have our Ontario Rat number 1, which is in the same area blade length-wise, and the Rat number 2, which is a little bit smaller. And trying to think if there's anything else worth comparing. Sure, right here we got ourselves a Chris Reeve Knives, large Shabazz in the Insingo blade. So again, you're right in that sort of area in terms of your size. So there you go. Let's go on ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this particular custom knife. So first off, on the good side, I'm a big fan of the blade shape. This is a straightforward Wharncliffe blade. It's not as tactical or crazy because of this rounding here, which makes it feel a lot more organic than some of your really murdery sort of Wharncliffes like you see on the ZT Wharncliffes or otherwise. But I'm a big fan of a Wharncliffe blade. They're great for a bunch of different kinds of utility cutting. This is a Graham Razel Mid-Tech up here. And they're just spectacular in a lot of ways for everyday life. I like Wharncliffes, and so it's nice to see a really high-end one like this. Second thing I want to comment on is the blade on this guy overall. It's not super thick. I mean, you can look at this little area here. There's a nice swedge through it, but this little area here shows you the overall thickness, and relative to, say, a Spyderco PM2, we're right in that same ballpark. So it's not a thickness, it's not an overly thick, overly overbuilt sort of knife. And in fact, if we look at the edge here, at the chopping choil, you can see that it's relatively thin behind the edge, which makes this a quality cutting tool. Absolutely. The grind could maybe be a little bit deeper, but it works just fine in that way. Nice, nice, nice. The steel on this blade is CTS XHP. That's got kind of an acid wash through it. And I gotta say, the acid wash on it is surprisingly nicely done. It shouldn't surprise me at this much, but I don't tend to love acid washes. But this one is very nice in that it's subtle, but it's also smooth. It's a comfortable acid wash. It doesn't feel like it's constantly dirty in the way that a badly done acid wash can. So I like very much the acid wash on this blade, and I don't tend to love acid washes. The fact that there's still a little reflectivity, although the knife is slightly oiled at the moment, just makes this overall very nice. Speaking of nice, I'm a big fan of the size of this knife overall. It is not a tiny knife by any stretch. I mean, next to the PM2 here, there is a fair amount of blade. But it actually tucks itself very nicely into a small package here. Being an integral and being, well, folding up in the way that it does, the blade really disappears into this small part of the handle. And so in the pocket, this is relatively small, and it's got very little in the way of flipper tab. So there's not a huge pocket packer that you got to be worried about here with this. So the size of this, it's very, very carryable. And in this, I felt the same way about the Nirvana, which is also a Peter Rassenti design. Very nice in that way. There are some very nice details on here too, which you would hope for in an expensive custom knife. For instance, the pivot screw on this guy is actually made of zirconium, which is interesting. It's a different choice. This is the first knife I've handled with a zirconium screw, so that's kind of neat. And this black color comes from torching it, actually. It's got a nice G10 inlay here, as requested by my buddy Nico. The fasteners on them are honestly, it's beautifully done. You can see here that there's this nice little tri-wing pattern, but it's a conventional Torx in the middle there, and you can see similarly on the pocket clip screws, the screws are nicely made. So I feel like those little details are done nicely as well. The lock bar relief cut here see if I can show that to you. You can see Peter Rassenti's little signature has been milled in right here, which is it's a nice way to do things, honestly. It puts the signature on the knife in a way that's not super obtrusive. It's not on the clip. It's not cluttering up the blade. It's on there, but it's a little bit subtle, so I like that very much. And then I do love very much in this design the curve of the blade going into the handle. It follows one consistent curve and it kind of falls right into there, and it has a very nice feel to it overall. Just looking at it organically, and there's sort of a nice counterbalance. This is a beautiful knife, and it's beautifully done in that way. And then finally, perhaps one of the most interesting things about this knife is that it is an integral knife, which means that there is only one chunk of titanium that makes this knife up. Well, technically two if you count this little tiny chunk for the stop pin, but if you look at it, there are no gaps whatsoever here. This is just a chunk of metal that's got a track milled out here for the blade to go into, and a lock bar milled out from the same piece of metal. This is, shall we say, non-trivial to do, because, well, you need to be doing all of this. All of your work is happening in this little groove here, and you need to put the stop pin in an interesting way. You need to sort of drill that out, but then you can see Peter has sanded in that little area. I mean, the integral side of it is something that makes a big difference in terms of the amount of work, and it also makes a big difference in terms of, well, the knife itself. It lends to a very beefy construction because it is a single chunk of metal. You're not worried about backspaces or anything because it's a single freaking chunk of metal. Also fairly durable and fairly compact. And in terms of simplicity of construction, I will very often praise knives that have relatively few screws that hold it together. This guy has one right here. And that's kind of nice. I like very much that aspect of integrals. When it's done well, they can be supremely easy to disassemble, and they can just be great in that overall way. And so I really do have to praise the fact that Peter's making custom integrals. That's not a straightforward thing to do, and so I got to give credit there. So that's what's good about this knife. It's an integral, which has lots of fun kind of consequences for it. It's got some really nice details going on there. A well-done acid wash on the blade. The blade itself is of a good steel, CTS XHP, with a nice acid wash, I think I said already. I love the shape. The size of the knife overall is pretty wonderful in the pocket. Let's talk about what's great about this knife. The great part about this knife, absolutely 100%, is the action. I got to handle a custom Rassenti Druid, a different one, at Blade HQ some months back, and what blew me away was the action, and this is absolutely no exception. The action on this is spectacular. This has the very best detent that I've dealt with in my life as a knife reviewer. The detent is just amazing. It's got a very beautiful sound to it. I hope that translates well, but it's great, and it has a very nice kind of click to it. It's like the nearest analogy I can come up with is a very, very nice button, the trigger, that has a really strong kind of pop, like apply, and then suddenly an effortless sort of pop. It's a beautiful, beautiful detent, and it fires absolutely reliably. There is zero chance of this improperly deploying, which is great. And actually the closing is pretty smooth as well, and I suspect it's going to smooth out much further as it ages, so to speak, because right now the detent ball is still wearing a little pat through the acid wash on the blade. As that happens over time, this is going to become an even smoother closing knife, and the one that I handled at Blade HQ had an incredible fall shot action as well, and because that didn't have the acid wash. So I think this is a knife that's got a great detent now. It's got a great action and closing now, even relative to a lot of other knives, and as it ages, it's just going to get smoother. And so the action on this knife is 100% incredible. The other thing I gotta highlight is the sound, and this is something I struggle capturing over a phone microphone that this is recording on. But it has a really satisfying sound, and in many ways that sound is more satisfying than my favorite action in a knife I own, which is the Grimsmo Norseman here. The detent on this is similar, but I love the sound of deploying this knife. This has a fidget factor. This has a detent factor that's just spectacular. I could flip this knife all day and be a happy little man. So that's what's great here, is the action. Let's talk about what's not so great, the bad. So on the bad side, first on the maintenance side, integrals do have some maintenance challenges. For instance, if you do overextend the lock bar, you push the lock bar too far in this direction, that's a much bigger problem because you can't just take the scales apart and then bend it back. Your travel on the lock bar is limited by the other side here, so if you do something like that, you're going to have to send it back to Peter for a fix. Also, there's no lock bar insert on here, which is a little bit, well, that can be a bit of a problem, because if this wears out again, you're going to have to replace the entire handle of the knife, and probably won't be a factor on a custom knife like this that may not get as much pocket time as something that you carry every single day, but it is something to keep in mind. Next issue is that the zirconium hardware. Zirconium's a great metal, but it can also scratch up relatively straightforwardly, either in use or in disassembly. That's another part of the reason I'm not taking this guy down. The zirconium hardware could very easily. Zirconium is not naturally this black shade. In fact, it's got a silvery overtone, and so there's a chance if you go at this with a driver, you're going to scratch off that black oxide layer. I think it's an oxide layer, and instead you end up with some silver on there. That can be ugly quickly. You can fix it with a torch, but heating up your screws has another issue entirely. So there you go. Next issue is the stop pin here. You can see that it actually doesn't match the rest of the finish of the knife, and that's one of the things that impressed me very much about the Spyderco Nirvana, which was that the stop pin did match the eventual finish of the rest of the knife. It seems a little odd that that's been skipped here, and it adds a little, it breaks visually up something that could be very, very, very clean. Seems a little off to me. I gotta highlight, as I'm nitpicking here, that there are some gaps, just very tiny gaps, both between the G10 and the titanium here, and a couple of little imperfections in the seam between the stop pin and the rest of it. It's not a big deal in any way, shape, or form, but at a knife this expensive, that's starting to get a little bit like, oh, that's a little strange. And there were some missing features relative to some of your modern knives. I mentioned already there's no lock bar insert here, but there's also no over-travel stop, which means that, unless the clip serves as a bit of an over-travel stop, but by and large, it's going to be pretty straightforward to overextend this, and that can cause problems here. I also have to say that in a knife that's this expensive, at $1,300, CTS XHP, it's a great steel, but it's getting up there. The fact that he did an acid wash makes that in some ways more understandable, because XHP takes an etch a lot better than some of your other higher echelon sorts of steels. But still, that's a lot of money for XHP. And so, I don't know how I feel about that. Availability is, of course, limited. This is a custom knife, and so you're either going to have to reach out to Peter yourself, and I believe his books are closed, or you're going to have to win one on like a lottery on an Instagram, something along those lines, or buy it on the secondary market. So that's not so great. You can't just go down to your store and pick one of these up. And then finally, you probably can't pick one up at all because the price is huge. You're looking at $1,300 on this, and that's a lot of money to spend on anything, let alone a pocket knife. So that's bad. I mean, look, no matter how well you like this knife, how matter great it is, it's just a lot of money, and so we got to keep that in mind. I definitely wish this was less expensive, but I wish that about pretty much everything in life, so not a huge deal. But anyways, that's what's bad. The price is huge, the availability is limited, it's missing some features relative to some of your other production knives out there in the world. There are some occasional gaps, the zirconium hardware can be a little bit scratchy prone, and integrals have some maintenance challenges in the longer term. Let's talk about what's ugly about this little guy. The ugly thing here, which I kind of understand at some level but still bugs me, is the fact that this knife has a lot of very sharp edges. Now, I can understand that it gives a cleaner look to make straight cuts. For instance, on this little corner right here. You can see that this is just a solid 90-degree angle, or, well, I can't vouch exactly for the angle, but still. This is just a kind of two interfaces right next to each other. And it looks very clean, and indeed the entire knife, the machining looks incredibly clean. We could throw that under the grate if we wanted to. But the problem is, without that chamfering, it's kind of uncomfortable in the hand, particularly right back here. Because the way a flipper tab works generally is that you use your index finger to push against the inside of your hand right here. And when you do that on this knife, these two hard corners are pressing into your hand, and that's just not super comfortable. And similarly, the chamfering on the edge of the flipper tab here is, well, it's missing entirely. And so this knife, just desperately needs a visit from the chamfering fairy, and if I bought this knife hoping to carry it on a regular basis, I would honestly probably send it back to Peter and ask him to do that chamfering, even if it would disrupt the visual sort of effect of the knife overall, because it is a bit of a functional issue. It'll wear down over time if you really do carry this knife and beat on it, but he really chose to favor the visual precision and crispness over comfort in the hand. And from my perspective, which is not everybody's, that's a little bit of a problem. So to me, that's the ugly here, which is that you really need a little bit more chamfering for this to feel great as a functional tool in the hand. So let's go ahead and jump into the final conclusion about this knife. Let me address kind of the elephant in the room with any custom knife review on my channel, and that's that I don't tend to do custom knives. They're really a different game. Most of what I review are production knives, or mid-techs, which is code for really expensive production knives. These are knives that you judge on the basis of functionality and value, and then if they happen to be really nice, that's really a bonus. Whereas custom knives are kind of playing a different game. They're trying to make something that's different, that's artistic, that's unique, and from high-end makers. And there will be functional compromises to that end, and the price doesn't necessarily flow directly from the materials, from the function, etc. Whether that's good, bad, or ugly is going to be up to you, but I can already hear some of my most vocal commenters just coming out guns blazing on this one. Because it's a $1,300 knife that uses CTS XHP that doesn't have a lock bar insert. It's flawed in the hand with the chamfering issue, seriously, and, practically speaking, there were some issues here. The zirconium may not last that long, etc. And so this knife is going to be just way off the table for a lot of people on the basis of price alone, and then on the basis of what they want in a knife. I mean, if you're just looking for a nice EDC sort of option, this is obviously not what you want to do. This is a very different category. But that's, again, not really what this knife is about. You don't buy a Rassenti custom knife, or any other custom knife for that matter, because you just need a pocket knife. You buy it because you like art, and you need to cut stuff sometimes. And in that light, I think this is a great custom knife. It is very good art. I mean, it is a custom knife by a well-known maker. It's an integral, which is really a showing of skill here. I can't really downplay, or I shouldn't downplay, the amount of effort it takes to do an integral this well, with, perfect centering, perfect detent, perfect everything. I mean, the Rassenti Nirvana from Spyderco was really well done, but this is in a different class. It's also very nicely built, nicely machined, precisely machined. It's got an action that you really have to feel to believe, and oh my god, that freaking sound. But on top of all that, it's also a pretty good everyday carry knife. It's not huge. It cuts things very effectively. It has made the cut. I mean, the steel is good to go. This isn't like a, $1,000 440C sort of knife. The clip on it is just fine. And, the only serious flaw in this guy is the chamfering, which isn't going to bother a lot of people, especially if you're willing to favor that visual look to it. And so, the final conclusion here is that if you're just after a knife, this is silly. It's way more expensive than it is practical, and you're really far up that curve of diminishing returns. And some functional sacrifices are being made in the name of art. And so, given what I do on this channel and my personal tastes, this doesn't quite hit gem status. The value isn't there, and functionally speaking, you're taking some compromises. But it is still a very good example of the knife-making art that you can carry and still absolutely use. And if you're really after that, if you're looking to buy a really high-end custom knife that's still very practical in the pocket, this is a pretty damn good choice. So that's kind of where I land. It's probably not for you, it's definitely not for me, but it is still very impressive, and for what it is, there's a lot of good here. So thank you very much, Nico, for sharing your art, and Peter Rassenti, holy crap, that detent, keep doing that, holy crap. So there you go. I hope this was interesting, that this review was integral to your day, and mostly, though, that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.